Well, hello, everyone, and thanks for joining me for this overview of the MMPI-3 Public Safety Candidate Interpretive Reports. I'll briefly go over some of the major revisions of the MMPI-3, then discuss the empirical foundations for the suite of Public Safety Candidate Interpretive Reports. I'll then discuss the rationale and structure of the reports and close with one or two case illustrations, depending upon what time permits. I don't know what happened to this slide, so let me just quickly to tell you that I have financial interest in this report. I received funding from the University of Minnesota Press, which is the publisher of the MMPI-3 instrument and reports, and as a co-author of the MMPI-2 RF Police Candidate Interpretive Report and the MMPI-3 Public Safety Candidate Interpretive Reports, I receive royalties on the sale of these instruments. With respect to the major revisions of the MMPI-3, 72 new test items have been added to the inventory. 75 of the items that were on the MMPI-2 and the MMPI-2 restructured form have been dropped. So there are now 335 items in total on the MMPI-3. There are 5 new scales, one new validity scale, the CRIN, Combined Response Inconsistency Scale, a combination of VRIN and TRIN, and 4 new substantive scales, eating concerns, compulsivity, impulsivity, and self-importance. 3 scales have been substantially modified from the MMPI-2 restructured form. Anxiety scale is now the anxiety-related experiences. Stress and worry has been bifurcated into a stress scale and a worry scale. And interpersonal passivity has been reversed and is now dominance. 5 substantive scales have been dropped in order to make room for new items and expansion of several scales and new scales. Gastrointestinal complaints, head pain complaints, multiple specific fears, and the 2 interest scales. The reading level on the MMPI-3 remains the same grade level on the Flesch-Kincaid 4.5 grade level. In total, there are 52 scales on the MMPI-3, 10 validity scales, 3 higher order scales, 8 restructured clinical scales, 26 specific problem scales, including 4 somatic cognitive, 10 internalizing, 7 externalizing, and 5 interpersonal functioning scales. And then 5 personality psychopathology 5 scales. Importantly, the MMPI-3 has new norms. The norms for the MMPI-2 RF were those from the MMPI-2, developed in the 1980s. And society has changed considerably. At the time that the previous norms were established, no one had even heard of the internet, much less used it, and social media was not a thing. So society has changed considerably, and the need for new norms coincided also with the change in demographics in the United States in particular. So the new normative sample was selected to approximate the 2020 census projections on the basis of race, education, and age. Final sample consists of 810 men, 810 women, for a total of 1,620. And the MMPI-3 uses non-gendered T-scores. The Public Safety Candidate Interpretive Report, like its the original Police Candidate Interpretive Report, is empirically derived, and briefly discuss some of the empirical foundations for these interpretive reports. First is information contained in the technical manual. Appendix D contains a sample of police candidates from the Pacific Northwest. We see briefly here, this is a group of men ranging in sample size 351 to 472. And we see, as an example, behavioral externalizing dysfunction correlates with biodata clusters, including a history of alcohol use problems, drug use problems, and failure to meet obligations. Just as we would expect to see, these correlations indicate that the externalizing scale actually correlates with the history of externalizing behaviors. In addition, we correlated it with the California Psychological Inventory of CPI 434 version, which contains some special scales developed by Mike Johnson and Mike Roberts, and now Ryan Roberts. And they include the poor psychological suitability, anger problems, alcohol use problems, illegal drug use problems, substance use proclivity. We see these correlations of externalizing traits of personality correlating with other measures of externalizing. Also with antisocial behavior and with hypomanic activation. Poor suitability correlates with a range of both higher order and restructured clinical scales. Involuntary departure also correlating with externalizing and some of the thought dysfunction scales. We also see these same correlations with a sample of women, so it holds true across genders as well. Appendix E of the technical manual includes a sample of police candidates, both from the Pacific Northwest and from Southern California. And these were designed to compare these studies, these analyses designed to compare the correlations from the restructured form of the MMPI-2 or the RF against the new version of the MMPI-3. And as we see here with a sample of Pacific Northwest candidates, the correlations that we found on both, as we discussed previously, biodata and CPI hold true for the RF and the MMPI-3. Now, these comparisons and these shared correlations are critical to our ability to generalize validity data from the MMPI-2 RF to the MMPI-3. And this provides empirical support for that general. You see these correlations extend across various measures, both concurrently administered tests of personality, such as a CPI, as well as biodata. And they also correlate with regard to external correlations of outcomes, performance outcomes. The Selection Validation Survey, or SVS, has been used in a number of studies. And this is a measure that the training division of a police department completes after a police recruit has completed field training and probation. And it is a measure of various problems on the job during training: academic learning problems, driving problems, failure to control conflict, failure to engage, navigation problems, report writing problems, as well as a number of composite variables concerning their performance, such as problems with constraint or stress-related problems or general learning problems or multitasking problems. And we see that these correlations that have been identified previously with the MMPI-2 RF are also seen with the MMPI-3. So RC8, for example, has been shown to correlate with academic learning problems, and we see the same correlation with RC8 for the 3. We see that with report writing problems, or the preference for an agency to not have or to have a recruit similar to the one that has been evaluated, or overall performance problems. So these correlations showing that the MMPI-3 correlates not only with other measures of personality, but also, as it did with the RF, but also with external measures of performance, confirm the generalizability of findings from the RF to the MMPI-3. Another source of validity data is and empirical foundations for the PSCIR, excuse me, are found in the user's guide for the public safety candidate interpretive reports. External correlates show up between the MMPI-3 and the CPI are listed for police candidates, correctional candidates, dispatcher candidates, and firefighter medic candidates, as well as correlations with the Ocateligan's multidimensional personality questionnaire, or the the MPQ. Also in the user's guide is a summary of published peer-reviewed articles for the MMPI-2 RF police candidate using the MMPI-2 RF in validation for police candidates, as well as the MMPI-3 for police and other public safety candidates, all discussed in the user's guide. So with respect to the public safety candidate interpret reports, this is a suite of reports that include the police candidate interpret report, or PSCIR, the correctional candidate interpret report, or CCIR, the dispatcher candidate interpret report, or DCIR, and the firefighter or medic candidate interpret report, or the FCIR. Now, they all share the same underlying rationale and structure. The first element of that rationale is for purposes of efficiency as well as error control. There are 289 job relevant correlates that are in the library of interpretive statements in the PSCIRs. It is simply impossible for anyone even knowledgeable about the underlying research to hold those job relevant correlates in mind when interpreting the instrument, particularly when we consider that of the 42 substantive skills of the MMPI-3, 36 of them generate one or more of these job relevant correlates, but importantly at 14 different T-score levels below 65T. When one is interpreting the MMPI-3 at T-scores of 65 or above, one needs only to make reference to the manual for administration scoring and interpretation and identify the inferences that can be drawn from that scale elevation. But when interpreting scores below 65T, it's necessary to link those inferences to empirical findings, and only at the T-score level justified by the underlying research. That requires an automated interpretation. In addition, each interpretive statement in the report is annotated to reveal both the scales on which the interpretation is based and the published research upon which it is based, allowing you to dig deeper if necessary in order to understand the source of that inference. The reports are all focused on predicting consequential behavior and job relevant traits. There are 32 job performance outcomes in the PSCIR and 67 job relevant personality behavioral characteristics for all of the interpret reports, and it's demonstrably free of adverse impact. When one is interpreting an instrument at established T-score levels, it's possible at that it is then possible to be able to determine whether there is any differential prediction based on gender or race. One can't do that if the interpretation can be made at varying T-score levels rather than an established threshold level. So we've been able to determine that for the major Title VII protected classes, Blacks, Hispanics, and females, relative to white and male candidates, there is no disproportionate triggering of problem statements by these interpretive reports. it's also important to have comparison groups that are position specific. There is no public safety comparison group because public safety candidates fall into four major classes: police, correctional officers, dispatchers, and firefighter medics. So having comparison groups that are different for each one allows us to determine whether or not a score is an outlier for that comparison group or normative for it. And of course, it's critical that those comparison groups are derived from samples of candidates who took the test under very light conditions. Let me say too that one of the benefits of an interpretive report, excuse me, that's automated and linked to empirical data is that it prevents two major errors that often occur when interpreting in a selection context in particular. One is the failure to identify correlations and inferences that are supported by a scale elevation, failing to recognize those because the T-score that is being interpreted is below 65. But in addition to that is the error of drawing inferences or making inferences that are not supported by the empirical literature. And having an interpretive report will prevent both of those errors from occurring. The comparison groups are described in the user's guide based on their geographic origin, what part of the country, as well as Canada, the community of origin, rural, suburban, and urban environments, race and ethnicity, age, and education. Importantly, the 2,036 members of the police officer comparison group, the corrections comparison group, dispatcher comparison group, and firefighter comparison group score very similarly on the MMPI-3 both on the validity scales and the substantive scales, as you'll see in a moment. There is greater differences on the L scale. We see that, going back here, we see that the mean for the correctional candidates is 61, and the mean for dispatchers, for example, is 54. So on the L scale, we see more differences. On K, we see fewer. And on the substantive scales, we see very little difference, one exception being RC2, where dispatcher candidates tend to have a higher mean score, 45, relative to the other three positions. And when this occurs, it can, as it does with RC2, result in a differential threshold for triggering interpretive statements for the RC2. So it would be interpretive statements for the dispatcher candidate interpretive report begins at 61T for the DCIR. It begins at 57T for the other three positions. We see almost no differences at all for somatic cognitive and internalizing domain, externalizing domain, somewhat around cynicism and activation, very little on the interpersonal scales or on the personality psychopathology 5 scales. So the four comparison groups are quite similar, but there are some important differences that are reflected both in the threshold levels required for triggering an interpretive statement and in the reports themselves. Now, the content and structure and the content of the reports are identical to one another. They are identical in terms of the presentation of the scores, the figures and tables in the report. It includes a synopsis of key findings, protocol validity discussion, findings related to clinically significant scores, comparison group findings, job relevant correlates, item level information, and of course, annotations and reference endnotes for all interpretive statements. Each report contains in its italicized text boilerplate language that provides guidance to the users. It includes a synopsis that gives a brief overview of all the major findings contained in the report, and provides information about protocol validity, including the major threats to validity of the protocol, content non-responsiveness, or unscorable or inconsistent responses, over-reporting, which we tend not to see much of in selection settings, and under-reporting, which we tend to see a great deal more. There's then a discussion of clinical findings, which contain clinically significant symptoms, personality characteristics, and behavioral tendencies. There's also discussion of diagnostic considerations. Some test users prefer not to have diagnostic considerations in the report, and so that is a user suppressible option. Before printing the report, one simply clicks the button on the options for the printing the report, and that would be suppressed. There's also discussion of comparison group findings, which describes the substantive scale findings in the context of the particular comparison group. So, for example, in this particular case, we see under unusual thoughts, perceptions, and beliefs, the test taker reports a comparatively high level of unusual thinking for a police candidate. Only 1.0% of comparison group members convey such thoughts as this at this or a higher level. More specifically, he reports a relatively high level of persecutory beliefs for a police candidate. Only 3.9% of comparison group members convey this or a greater level of persecutory thinking. Now, each of those statements has an endnote, and that endnote would tell you what scale, at what T-score level has generated that statement. And it describes, as I just illustrated, describes the construct that's measured by the scale and the percentage of the comparison group members who scored at or beyond this level. Now, these interpretive statements are not identical to what one would find in the Manual for Administration Scoring and Interpretation, because the Manual for Administration Scoring and Interpretation provides interpretive statements for T-scores at 65 or higher. While the PSCIR will also include interpretive statements at 65 T or higher, it also, when warranted, provides interpretive statements for scores below 65, but those are never simply modifications of what one would find in the Manual for Administration Scoring and Interpretation, because those are clinical interpretations. These are non-clinical interpretations that are contained only in the report and not in the manual. The job-relevant correlates include job-relevant personality characteristics and behavioral tendencies of the test taker. And I'll illustrate those in a bit with some specific case illustrations. And they're organized according to 10 problem domains that are very similar to the California Post, in some cases identical to the California Post psychological screening dimensions: emotional control and stress tolerance problems, routine task performance problems, decision-making and judgment problems, feedback acceptance problems, social competence and teamwork problems, integrity problems, conscientiousness and dependability problems, and others. The job-relevant correlates include both post-hire performance outcomes. Now, these are available currently only for the PSCIR because they're based upon information derived from the candidate's performance during field training and probation. We are currently collecting post-hire performance outcomes for correctional officers, dispatchers, and firefighter paramedics or medics. And these will be included in future PSCIR updates once the studies are peer-reviewed and published. Examples in the emotional control and stress tolerance problems domain include difficulties coping with stress, being easily irritated and annoyed by others, difficulties performing under stressful conditions, being made anxious by change and uncertainty. In the routine task performance problems, they include avoiding seemingly complex challenges, lacking in confidence in one's own abilities, difficulty making use of one's talents. For the PSCIR, it includes some performance outcomes, such as difficulties carrying out tasks under non-stressful conditions, cognitive adaptation problems, report writing problems. These kinds of statements will also be available, as I mentioned a moment ago, for the other 3 public safety positions once that validity data is in, analyzed, peer-reviewed, and published. It includes multitasking problems in the decision-making and judgment problems domain, difficulties with effective decision-making, being made anxious by change or uncertainty, being rigid and inflexible, feedback acceptance problems, being more likely to brush off criticism and other negative feedback, being less likely to reflect on one's own behavior and projecting blame onto others. Assertiveness problems, being ill at ease in dealing with others, tendency to be unsure and act hesitantly, disliking leadership roles. And for the PSCIR, again, an outcome from performance data, failing to engage or confront subjects in circumstances in which an officer would normally approach or intervene. Now, even though that statement will be triggered by at whatever level that statement is triggered for the scales correlated with it, that same score for a correctional officer would not produce that statement because we don't have the empirical evidence at present to show that that statement applies to a correctional officer with that score level. When the studies are complete and we have that information available, then we'll have those sorts of outcome statements and job relevant correlates for those other positions. Social competence and teamwork problems, being self-centered, opinionated and outspoken, demanding, difficulties trusting others. Integrity problems, including being self-indulgent, having skeptical or antisocial views of the world, lacking a commitment to societal rules, believing that life is unfair and that exploiting opportunities for personal gain is justified. Conscientiousness and dependability problems, the history of absenteeism or tardiness, giving up easily and not persevering in the face of challenges. And for the PSCIR, problems attending court, problems with initiative and drive, such as obtaining information and evidence needed to solve crimes and explain incidents. Impulse control problems, being rebellious and lacking discipline, being unpredictable in behavior and attitudes. And for the PSCIR, engaging in conduct unbecoming a police officer and problems controlling and de-escalating conflict. So in the remaining time, I'm going to present 2 cases. One is Mr. R. Mr. R is a 32-year-old married male correctional officer candidate with a state corrections department. And during the psychological pre-employment post-offer psychological evaluation, he revealed that he had been recently evaluated for a military service-connected disability following his honorable discharge from the U.S. Marine Corps after 8 years of service. That included 2 one-year deployments to combat zones. He also disclosed that he was awarded a 70% disability rating for post-traumatic stress disorder from the Veterans Benefits Administration. And the examining psychologist confirmed that rating by receiving the rating decision letter from the Veterans Benefits Administration. He also indicated that he had never received treatment for his PTSD. So let's look at Mr. R's CCIR. We see that CRIN and BRIN are slightly elevated, particularly relative to the comparison group, but not to the degree that it undermines the validity of the protocol. His score on L is at 56T and on K is at 71T. Here we see an elevation relative to the comparison group, but not clinically elevated on RC2 with a T-score of 57. Notice that the comparison group data for correctional officers has a mean score of 42. So Mr. R's score on RC2 is 15 T-score points, nearly 3 standard deviations above the mean for the correctional candidate comparison group. That places it at the 99.3rd percentile for that score. You see the top arrow is pointing to this open white diamond. For all of the reports in the PSCIR suite, the open diamond indicates the mean score for that comparison group. The gray bar above and below that diamond indicates 1 standard deviation above and below the mean for the comparison group. So we see that and of course the black circles connected by that dark black line is the candidate's scores. So we see relative to the comparison group, he's quite elevated on RC2, but not clinically significant. So we're not able to make any, and would not make in the report, any statements about RC2 relative to depression, because that would require a clinically significant or a score of 65T or higher, clinically elevated. But Mr. R has a non-clinically elevated score. So what we would say about Mr. R with respect to RC2 would depend solely on what the research evidence tells us we can infer from that elevated score. There's the comparison group mean and standard deviation. We see now on the internalizing scale, we see that anxiety-related experiences is at the 99.8 percentile. If you look at that bottom line, where we see percent scoring at or below the test taker, still not clinically significant, but as expected, given his history of PTSD, we would expect to see elevation on that scale. Social avoidance at a T-score of 60. Now, on the substance abuse scale, you'll note that it says where you see response percent at the bottom of that oval is 89. That indicates that Mr. R responded to only 89% of the items on the substance abuse scale. So with the in light of that, anytime it's below 90, we're not able to rely upon that test score. We're not able to rely upon that as a reliable test score. So we're not going to interpret a non-elevated score on substance abuse because we don't have enough responses to be able to consider it a reliable measure. We'll come back to that here in a moment. And of course, we see a T-score of 73 on introversion, low positive emotionality on the personality psychopathology 5 scales. Now, this page 7 of the report always contains these MMPI-3 T-scores by domains. And the scores that are interpreted in the report are printed in bold font. So we can quickly see that that K with a score of 71T, RC2, introversion, low positive emotionality, anxiety-related experiences, and social avoidance. Those scales are all interpreted in the report. The synopsis indicates that the validity scales do raise concerns about the possible impact of unscorable responses on the validity of the protocol. And with that caution noted, there are no indications of clinically significant somatic or cognitive complaints or of clinically significant emotional, thought, behavioral, or interpersonal dysfunction. In the absence of an elevated RC scale, associated with a facet from the Psy-5, we don't interpret a clinically elevated Psy-5 score alone. Comparison group findings, however, point to possible concerns about low positive emotions, anxiety, and social avoidance. And possible job-relevant problems are identified in the following domains: emotional control and stress tolerance, routine task performance, decision-making and judgment, assertiveness, and social competence and teamwork. Moving to protocol validity, the test taker answered less than 90% of the items on substance abuse. The resulting score may therefore be artificially lowered. In particular, the absence of elevation on this scale is not interpretable. Discussion of over and under reporting follows. And there, of course, there are no clinically significant findings, so there are no indications of clinically significant dysfunction. And naturally, no diagnostic considerations are listed. With respect to comparison group findings, the test taker's responses indicate a level of introversion and low positive emotions that is likely incompatible with public safety requirements for good interpersonal skills and emotional adjustment. This level of introversion is uncommon in correctional candidates. Only 0.2% of comparison group members give evidence of this or a greater level of social withdrawal and low positive emotions. And he reports a comparatively high level of anxiety for a correctional officer. Only 0.6% of comparison group members convey this or a greater level of anxiousness. So you're able then to, when providing a report to the agency, you're able to indicate how rare this score is relative to the comparison group and use that information both in terms of helping them understand how unusual it is, but also factor it into your own analysis for determining the overall suitability of the candidate. You see the endnote, if you were viewing this as a PDF on your computer, placing your cursor over that endnote would provide this hypertext telling you that this is based on the anxiety-related experiences scale with an elevation of 62T. We then move to the job-relevant correlates section of the report. In this case, compared with other correctional candidates, as test takers more likely to worry about problems and be uncertain about how to deal with them. Compared with other correctional candidates, test takers more likely to be lacking in confidence in his own abilities. Now, the language, by the way, whether we use his, her, or their, is based on what the candidate chooses for gender. If no gender is listed or a non-binary gender is listed, the pronoun there will be used. If they list a specific gender, male or female, then the appropriate pronoun will be used. Here we see that statement about being more likely to worry about problems and be uncertain about how to deal with them comes from the elevation on two scales, RC2 at 57T and introversion, low positive emotionality at 73T. Compare with other correctional candidates, the test taker is more likely to be made anxious by change and uncertainty and to be disengaged from his environment, more likely to be ill at ease in dealing with others and to be unsure and act hesitantly, and more likely to have difficulty creating and sustaining mutually satisfying relationships, have a limited social support network, and prefer to work out problems alone. It also indicates the domains in which no problems have been indicated, including feedback, acceptance, integrity, conscientiousness, and dependability, substance use, obviously that one being unreliable, and impulse control. Again, the endnotes will tell you that the statement about being ill at ease and dealing with others and being about being unsure and to act hesitantly comes from a correlate associated with RC2 and social avoidance. And it also tells you that the reference that you'll find to the empirical support for that is in reference number 3. Reference number 3 is the MMPI-3 user's guide for the public safety candidate interpretive reports. Item level information is provided as well, including with respect to unscorable items. Now, because this is a public presentation, we're not including the item for reasons of test security, but this particular item, number 266, is scored on BXD, RC4, substance abuse, and disconstraint. But because of the smaller number of items on the substance abuse scale, fewer than 90% of those items were answered, and therefore that particular scale is uninterpretable. Critical responses are those responses that were designated by Yossi Ben Porath and Akateligan as having critical item content that may require immediate attention and follow-up. None were scored in the key direction for Mr. R. And then, of course, user-designated item level information, so that you can print all of the items that the individual answered in the key direction for any scale or all scales, or no scales. And they will tell you how the individual responded, what percentage of the normative sample answered that item in the same way, in the key direction, and what percentage of the comparison group that responded to the item in the key direction. And then there are critical follow-up items, and this is a list of items that the person responded in a manner that public safety candidate screening experts determined warrant follow-up in the interview. We don't encourage the reading of an item to a person and asking them why they explained as they did, but rather identifying the underlying theme and incorporating that into your interview. The endnotes indicate whether the interpretation is based on a test response or a correlate, and if a correlate, what empirical source was relied upon. And the research reference list is included. Finally, the report ends with a listing of all item responses. This is an example of the dispatcher candidate interpreter report. In the case of Ms. F, Ms. F is a 24-year-old married female 911 call taker with a large dispatch center who applied for a dispatcher position with another large dispatch center in a neighboring county. Her work references were positive, except for her overuse of sick leave, which she attributed to chronic migraine headaches. During the interview, she said she had twice applied for a dispatcher position with her current agency, but was unsuccessful because she wasn't part of the social clique. So we see in this case, L is quite elevated, and K, adjustment validity, is low. So she is certainly claiming to be morally virtuous, but not psychologically well-adjusted relative to the comparison group or even to the normative sample. And as expected with a person who might be less well-adjusted than the normative sample, we see elevations on RC1, also consistent, of course, with her self-reported chronic somatic complaints. We see an elevation of on RC2 at 57, but you may recall me telling you earlier that the mean for dispatcher candidates is higher for RC2 relative to the other comparison groups. So we don't interpret RC2 for this population until the T-score of 61. Again, consistent with her self-report of migraine headaches, cognitive complaints, neurological complaints are all elevated, as is eating concerns, and hopelessness is also elevated. The T-score is 65, clinically significant. Cynicism is elevated at 55 T, and the personality psychopathology 5 are all within normal limits. So we see here that the underreporting scales are both interpreted in the report. RC1 is interpreted. Neurological concerns, cognitive complaints, helplessness, hopelessness, anxiety-related experiences, all are interpreted in this report. Again, we don't see an elevation on RC2 that is interpretable given the base rate for that elevation or for that scale in this comparison group. The synopsis indicates that there's some possible impact of underreporting on the validity of the protocol. And with that caution noted, the scores indicate clinically significant somatic and cognitive complaints and emotional dysfunction. Now, with an elevated L, what we might have is a person who actually has more problems than are being seen, but we don't invalidate the protocol based upon elevated L. We simply understand that the scores may underrepresent the degree of problems that she's actually experiencing. Under overreporting, there are no indications of overreporting, and under underreporting, it indicates that she reported being much less well-adjusted than a typical dispatcher candidate. Only 5% of the dispatcher candidate comparison group reported this or a lower level of psychological adjustment. Clinically elevated scales indicate that she's reporting vague neurological complaints, likely to present with multiple somatic complaints, is preoccupied with physical health concerns, is prone to developing physical problems in response to stress. She reports a diffuse pattern of cognitive difficulties, including memory problems, difficulties with attention and concentration, and possible confusion. She very likely complains about memory problems, has low tolerance for frustration, does not cope well with stress, and experiences difficulties in attention or concentration. And that the report goes on to discuss other inferences derived from her elevated scores of helplessness and hopelessness. Diagnostic considerations include somatic symptom disorder and disorders related to attention difficulties. Under comparison group findings, we note that only 2% of comparison group members convey the same or higher level of somatic preoccupation, and less than 1% of comparison group members convey the same or greater level of neurological complaints. Under emotional internalizing problems, 0.4% give evidence of the same or higher level of helplessness and hopelessness, and 3% of the comparison group members convey the same level of anxiety-related experiences. Their job relevant correlates compared with other dispatcher candidates. The test taker is more likely to develop physical symptoms in response to stress and worry about her health. And so I'll stop there, and in the remaining 10 minutes, answer any questions that you may have.
Well, good morning, Dr. Corey. This is Deb. Can you hear me okay?
I can, thank you.
Excellent. We have quite a few questions, so we'll get through as many as you can in the next 10 minutes. And as Sherry indicated at the top of the session, if people still want an answer to their question, there will be a survey that pops up at the end, and they can type it in there and someone will get back to them with an answer. So let's start with, there's a few questions about fitness for duty. Can you just clarify what report for MMPI-3 is appropriate for fitness for duty? This person's asking about first responders, but I suspect your answer might apply to all.
Absolutely does. And very good question. And I really appreciate it being asked. It is never appropriate to use a report from the Public Safety Candidate Interpretive Report Suite for a fitness for duty. It should be used only for pre-employment, post-offer psychological screening, or for selection purposes. For fitness for duty, you always want to use either the score report, if you're sufficiently familiar with interpretation, or the clinical settings interpretive report, for the MMPI-3. And the reason for that is fitness for duty evaluations are clinical evaluations. What you're assessing is whether or not, the three prongs of fitness for duty question are: first, does the person have a mental health condition? If yes, you move to the second prong, and that is that mental health condition, when active, at a is it likely to either is it likely to be job limiting, that is to impair their ability to perform the essential functions of their position, or pose a direct threat to themselves or others? If the answer to that second question is no, because of the ameliorative effects of treatment or medication, or because they've been off the job for a number of months, then the question is, when that condition, is that fitness likely to be sustained once they return to the job? So those questions are clinical questions, and they're going to be informed by clinical elevations on the MMPI-3. So the use of the clinical interpretive report or the SCORE report would be the proper report to use.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. That question gets asked a lot. Okay, I'm going to take you back to some of the slides that you went over comparing correlations between the 2RF and the 3. This individual said it looked like some of the correlations were lower on the MMPI-3. Can you explain why that might be occurring and whether or not people should be concerned about that?
Well, yeah, none of the differences were such that they would lose their ability to generalize from the RF to the 3. On some scales and on some measures, the 3 will be lower than the RF, but the reverse will be true on other variables that are being correlated. So I don't think that is that characterization is one of a pattern with the MMPI-3.
Okay, good clarification. Quick question about the cognitive problems. Those measured by the MMPI-3, is there any correlation with cognitive measures such as trail making, coding, or similarities that one would find?
It's a good question. I don't know the answer to that, but the answer to that will be available in the technical manual. I'm happy to get back with an answer to that. We could just maybe add that to the survey and provide that to the respondents later.
Yeah, it's a good question. I also am not aware of any research, but there's a lot of research out there. So we'll get back to whoever asked that. Here's one about scale elevations. Okay, can we interpret a scale with less than 90% response rate, but has a T-score in the clinical range?
Well, yeah, you could. Of course, yeah. What you're not able to do is interpret the absence of elevation as meaningful, but you can certainly interpret elevation as meaningful. So when you have less than 90%, what you're prohibited from doing is interpreting the absence of elevation as indicating the absence of problems associated with that scale. But if you do have elevations that are interpretable, you can interpret it with an understanding that it may be an underestimate of the problems associated with that construct.
Okay, great. A few more questions here that I think we should be able to get through. Another question about different group of individuals. Can you provide any information about using the MMPI-3 and its reports for assisting selection of individuals in specialized units such as emergency response teams?
Yeah, you wouldn't want to use these for a special unit or special assignment evaluation. There's a fair amount of controversy around what are sometimes referred to as PEPSs, or psychological evaluations for police special assignments. The controversy being, unless we know what the criteria are, we really can't identify, we really can't conduct the assessment. In other words, we know what the psychological dimensions are, and the psychological prerequisites are. We know the criterion standard for these 4 positions for pre-employment. But when you talk about, let's say, an undercover position for a police officer, we need to know what are the criteria for that position that's different from a police officer position. Well, we can speculate about that, and you may well be right about it, but we need to identify that criteria to begin with. And then we want to have an instrument that parses that out. Most practitioners in this area will be doing clinical assessments. That is, they'll be trying to identify psychopathology that might render that person unable to perform the job. But there may be other psychological traits and characteristics that are normal rather than psychopathological, in which case you'd be using an instrument like the MPQ or the CPI to aid you in identifying those.
Okay, so just a clarification, you're saying not these particular public safety candidate interpretive reports, but in this case of specialized units, would clinicians find like the score report or the clinical interp report helpful?
Absolutely.
Okay. All right. People are interested in whether or not you will be updating your assessing police and other public safety personnel now that the 3 is out.
Yes, that is already written, and it will be published next year.
Excellent. I think that brings us to closing time here. We have less than, actually, we're right on time at noon here, Central. So Dr. Corey, I want to thank you for this very informative overview and sharing your expertise with us. Any parting words before we close the webinar?
No, thank you for attending, folks, and appreciate it. Be sure to reach out to me if you have any questions at all.
Thanks, everyone. Please fill the survey in as you exit the webinar.